Last week, Indiana Democrats selected the O'Bannon team. And this week, here at the State Republican Convention, delegates selected the Goldsmith team. But how will the two compare? Join us as we rate the matchups. It's O'Bannon versus Goldsmith tonight on the Mike Pence Show.
I'd like the voter to ask him or herself which candidate can best position this state for the 21st century, which candidate can really deliver smaller, more responsive government, which candidate is committed to individual liberty and preservation of value-creating institutions and has a record of doing that. I think once the voters ask those questions, hopefully the answer will be me.
And I think I'm really committed to make Indiana the best that it can be. And we look at it in a sense of saying we want first-class schools in Indiana. We want higher paying jobs with a business climate that expands our business. We're talking about building safer and cleaner communities, continue to improve the quality of life. And I think we're also talking about restoring a sense of citizenship or doing government in a different way that brings back the sense of community that's so important in a democracy, to hold people together rather than split them apart.
It's the O'Bannon team versus the Goldsmith team, rating the matchups tonight on the Mike Pence Show. And helping us put it all together is Indiana's leading pollster, Dr. Brian Vargus of IU's Public Opinion Laboratory. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Mike. Nice to be here.
And going to the horse's mouth with the GOP and the Democratic Party, first up, State Republican Chairman Mike McDaniel.
How are you, Mike?
Thanks for joining us tonight. And State Democratic Chairman Joe Andrew holding forth as usual. We'll find reason behind his smugness in just a moment. But Brian Vargus, let's start with you. The leaders, the riders, rate these two tickets.
They're interesting tickets. In many respects, the Republican ticket is not a surprise, but it does, I think, present a problem.
Not a surprise?
No, not a surprise.
The Republican ticket?
I do not think it was
that would be the Goldsmith-Whitwer ticket
no,
was
no,
not a surprise?
Not a surprise.
So much for that leading
poster. No, it was not a surprise. And if you saw the polling numbers, you could see that.
Now, help me. How was that not a surprise to you?
This is a man who established himself by running for governor all over the state. He worked the state very well. He carried one county in the primary. Everybody knew him, and he resonated very well with the conservative right delegates that tend to be over-representative in a convention. And it was pretty clear that if he wanted it, it was his for the asking.
But what about? Let me. I want to get a lot to Whitwer in the next segment if we can. But what about the rest of the ticket? Mike McDaniel, were you, when you looked down at the Attorney General's race, Steve Carter jumping into the fray there, 800 votes win in opposition to Sue Ellen Reid, were you surprised by the way that convention shook out and the ticket you got?
Not at all. And from the standpoint that in Steve Carter's case, you had a gentleman who actually knocked on the doors of 500 delegates. And I think in a multi-candidate race like that, if you've got somebody who's generated that much individual support, and once you had a lead after the first ballot, it was an easy thing to get over the mark on a second ballot, and I think that's how Steve Carter won.
Joe Andrew, the no surprise ticket then. You pretty much called this.
I will be the first one to admit this is a complete surprise. I think that, but I do think that it's a good ticket for the Republicans nonetheless. None of the people who are running for LG would have been a disaster for Steve Goldsmith. But the fact of the matter is I think they still got someone who doesn't help them as much as someone else may have on that ticket. But I think it's a surprise. I think both of them are going to show a good comparison, some good differences that we'll talk about in the show.
I want to get into that. Now, what about these rating the tickets? You got the Goldsmith team, the O'Bannon team. What strengths, what weaknesses are there right now that we got the whole picture?
Okay, let me start with the Democrats for a second. I think there you really do have, if I got to rate these two guys' jobs in a sense, Joe's got the easier job, because he's got two candidates that fit better, quite frankly. He's got two guys who like each other, know each other well, and have
in
worked.
O'Bannon, Joe Kernan, two
and
guys known each other
before.
for a long time.
Mike's got an entirely different kind of problem. He's got a pragmatist running for governor with an ideologue for lieutenant governor. And
Steve Goldsmith is not an ideologue. Mike McDaniel, what about that? Is Steve Goldsmith
Brian's
a
a little off
pragmatist?
the mark on that. He's not completely off the mark, but a little off the mark. He's correct in that George Whitwer is very idea-oriented, but George's ideas are the kind of ideas that are kind of more broad. Steve Goldsmith tries to apply new ideas to specific problems, so it's a little different approach to things.
But I do
Is that
think,
fair?
I'll grant you that, but I still think that you got the tougher job in terms of
let
crafting
me see if I can stay with you on this. He has the tougher job. The Republicans have the tougher job because it's an unpredictable or unpredicted mix, whereas the Democrats nominated more of kind of a standard issue.
In a sense,
ticket?
yeah. But because the other side of it is you have to look at the characteristics of the candidates, and Mayor Goldsmith is somebody who likes to lay out the agenda, likes to control things, and so forth. And I can see a situation where you, in a strange sense, might have to referee a fight between your LG and your
Not gonna
gubernatorial
happen.
candidate.
I mean, these guys have so much energy, both of them. I mean, they're
that's
two
true.
incredibly energized kind of people. And
energy-
George Whitwer understands that Steve Goldsmith is at the top of the ticket, so George Whitwer is going to be in sync with Steve Goldsmith every step of the way in this
Isn't that
campaign. I don't
energy?
see it as a problem.
Aren't Joe Andrew? Aren't you a little bit worried about how much energy there is on the GOP ticket? That
No,
seems to
not
me
at-
to be one of the big strengths of a Goldsmith-Whitwer team.
Well, I think we've got energy on both sides. I think you saw that both parties had great state conventions. Ours was a big pep rally. A lot of people coming to that already to fight. We got to paint the picture we wanted to paint. I think that Mike will try to paint the picture that he wants to paint with his ticket as well. We got to talk about hands-on experience, people who actually have been able to accomplish a series of things. And I'm sure they'll have a painting that they want to get, a little picture they want everybody to come out with theirs as well.
Okay.
The difference was we chose ours more affirmatively.
Okay, we got to grab a quick break, guys. We'll continue to rate the matchups in the O'Bannon team versus the Goldsmith team and take a particular look at the lieutenant governor's race. George Whitwer against Joe Kerr.
We're at a time in Indiana's history where we're going to turn the corner and truly bring about these great values we've been fighting for, these great principles. The great principles that Steve Goldsmith as governor has been actually implementing. And the reason we're going to win is because he doesn't just talk the talk, he's been actually walking the walk, making it happen, and we're all going to work behind him to unite with him to create this future we're going to so proudly create for our children and our grandchildren.
Frank O'Bannon is, in my view, the best person to lead the state of Indiana for the next 4 years, that he is the heart and soul of all of what is good about this great state, and that I look forward to being able to make whatever contribution I can in order to guarantee his success, the success of our ticket, and ultimately the success of the state of Indiana.
Welcome back to the Mike Pence Show. It's the O'Bannon team versus the Goldsmith team, rating the matchups. And a part of the matchup that was decided this week was the second chair, the running mates. And we're fortunate to be joined by the same crew that was with us in the last segment. Let's start with you, Dr. Brian Vargus. Rate this matchup. You got a bit into the Whitwer-Kernan thing before, but
Okay.
who among these are the strongest, the weakest?
First place, I think it's a kind of a myth to say that a lieutenant governor helps you that much. You pick one that doesn't hurt you very much, and you hope that you get something that will give you geographic balance. Here you've got a sitting mayor who's got a record to both point at and be shot at for. And then you've got somebody who ran for governor and could be painted as well. He didn't win that, so he accepted that, and he's really not held any office.
Talking about George Whitwer.
George
now.
Whitwer.
Okay.
Opposite now? Oh,
No,
okay.
no. And then you start looking at that record. You also have to realize this is also a man who ran. He mentioned values in that clip. Those values are very important to him. He is in many respects comparable in a very real way to Alan Keyes, who lost out in the national.
Very strong conservative on social issues, but
Yeah.
now contrast that to a couple of guys. You've got a guy who's been lieutenant governor for 8 years in the Bayou administration, big record there, and you've got a mayor of South Bend. Is that what's better? Is coming into this thing
Well,
with a record or
I
without
think
a
the
record?
thing that hits the most is if you go back and look at those clips, the one thing that strikes you is there's an age difference, which gets to the energy factor that you were talking about earlier, and I think that is going to be one of the things that plays a hell of a
What
lot
are you
stronger
worried?
than
Are you
I don't
worried
think
about
so.
that at
Look,
all, Joe Andrew?
The worst thing I can say about George Whitwer was that he was my candidate. He was the guy that I wanted to win because I think that he brings the less than virtually anyone else who's running for lieutenant governor to the ticket in the sense
He
that
brings less than
he
anyone.
brings less than those people do. Only because of the fact, not because he's a bad guy, not because there's some problem with him, but because of the fact that what he does is solidify a conservative base that Steve Goldsmith's going to get anyway. Whereas a woman, maybe particularly a pro-choice woman, might have been able to reach into independent voters. I think that's the issue. Not that George Whitwer is bad, but that he's not as good for
is
them
that
as
real, Mike
someone else.
McDaniel? Is that right? George Whitwer brings nothing. It's a redundancy.
Let me tell you what he brings. They were talking about geography, and they were so proud that they put this ticket together and handpicked everybody and so forth and so on. The guy not only is from Northeast Indiana, which is a market that we need to work with that is going to be helpful to us there. He also has statewide name ID, not a whole lot, but he's got some that he generated.
We got
We're running
50,000
for
votes.
governor.
50,000
sure,
votes in the
statewide
spring.
that their candidate for lieutenant governor obviously doesn't have because he's in one media market, at least to this point. So that's another advantage. Then the energy level, and then solidifies all of the resources of a basic constituent group statewide, and he has some strengths in some other parts of the state that people didn't expect.
You
I mean,
forgot he has Scott
southeastern
County,
Indiana
for
and so forth and
example.
so on. Well,
Scott County.
you can-
Carried
you can-
Scott County.
You can make fun of the fact, but let me tell you something. The reason the guy won his lieutenant governor nomination was because he conducted himself like a gentleman throughout the gubernatorial race and built up a lot of friendships all across the state of Indiana, and that's going to serve him
great
very
point.
well.
Great point.
And
Great
he
point.
is, and he is many times.
He'll raise
I saw
money
him
too,
speak.
folks.
He's a good speaker, and he's going to be, I think, a good
Are these
campaigner.
guys-
But the
are
issue
these
is going
guys-
to be ideology, and I think that is the difficulty. I honestly think that there is a real problem brewing for the Republicans, and that's why I said I think Mike has a tough job, and that is reconciling the conservative ideology that Whitwer represents with the kind of pragmatic values that
See
you
now, but
fundamentally
that
believe
is
in.
fundamentally different from what Joe Andrew just said. Joe Andrew just said it's frickin' frack. They're the same thing
These are
here.
the same ideals people voted overwhelmingly for in 1994.
You're saying that Goldsmith and Whitwer represent different
No,
parts of the GOP
different
coalition.
styles.
Different styles. See, I don't disagree with Brian on that at all. I think my point was just comparing, not that there's a problem with George Whitwer, but compared to what the dangers could have been for Democrats from some of the other candidates, we've avoided those.
But see,
not
now,
George Whitwer doesn't hurt him necessarily.
Mike
but the
McDaniel,
fact he doesn't
haven't
help
you
him.
also avoided though
Yeah,
with
I mean,
a pro-choice nominee losing a part of the
listen,
GOP
we
coalition?
had all of this
what part of the
pre-convention stuff about how we were going to come out of this thing divided. Nobody was going to get along. Andrew was on talking about this in all kinds of other forms of the media prior to the convention, and it was
That's not
just
true.
wrong. It
Now,
is
I
true,
was,
and you know it.
A week before,
And
I was complimenting you
believe-
and how well you were
and-
running the
and
whole
thank you
process,
very much as
and
far
that
as
the
running
thing
the
was
convention.
smooth,
But you're
and that
talking about how
everybody's
we had this big
predictions
fight.
about this weren't going to
Give me a
happen.
break. It didn't happen, and he knows it.
Well, I
and
mean,
they
you know,
should be
thank
scared
you
to
very
death because
much.
we got a lot of energy coming
But
out of this thing.
doesn't Mike make a fair point? There were predictions that, my
Sure.
gosh,
Oh, no,
the
no,
only
I
And
know
people
those
against the
predictions are
Goldsmith.
going to come true. They're still going to come true, even though I wasn't the guy making
Oh,
them.
wait a
And
minute.
this
Brian
is-
Vargus,
and
Brian
because
Vargus.
Brian said
That
it.
is the point that I want. I still think that you've got a potential. I'm not predicting it, but I said there's a potential problem here when you've got somebody with a style of Steve Goldsmith trying to work with somebody of the value commitments that are so strong of George Whitwer. And it's reflective of something that goes right down the Republican ticket nationally, in point of fact.
Okay.
And I think it's a
Way
serious
overstated.
issue.
Way overstated.
Understated.
Understated.
It's a bigger problem.
If
even
I'm in the
than that.
middle, I think
I
I'm
don't
It's
think
better you
also-
stand for something than not stand for anything.
We'll have all year to settle it into the fall election. We'll come back with our bullpen, all of our regulars, and Brian Howey of the Howey Political Report. The O'Bannon team.
Well, I think it's great. I mean, we had a really exciting convention. We have an issue-driven campaign. I mean, it just resonates small government cutting taxes. It's exactly the contrast we want. The last 8 years of Democrat control have brought us bigger government and higher taxes, and I think it's just the exact right message for the public.
Joe Kernan shares my vision for a new Indiana. A new Indiana based on the foundation we've laid over the past 8 years in the O'Bannon administration. A new Indiana based on common sense Hoosier values. A new Indiana which will move forward in improving education, reducing crime, and moving people off welfare and into work. A new Indiana to make every citizen in this state the best that he or she can be.
Welcome back to the Mike Pence Show. It's the O'Bannon team versus the Goldsmith team, rating the matchups. In this part of the program, we call the bullpen, one of my favorite parts, and helping us make sense of the politics of all this, Brian Howey of the Howey Political Report.
You can call me Dr. Brian.
Welcome back aboard. Tom Rose, Republican with the Goldsmith administration. Nice to have you here.
Nice
and
to
Marion
be here.
County Chairman, my favorite Democrat, Kip 2. Welcome back to the program. Brian Howey.
Don't get flattered.
What
Kip,
about
he says
it?
that to all his guests.
What about it? Dr. Brian Vargus says the GOP's coming out of this convention divided. Is that the case?
I think Dr. Vargus is wrong on this thing. I think Goldsmith and Whitwer are going to be a good match, and I think they're going to get out what they want out of this ticket. All you have to do is go back to see the Wednesday editions in the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette and the News Sentinel. George Whitwer, LG candidate, hometown boy, isolated media market. They're going to get what they want out of it.
What about a Kip 2? Isn't really the Goldsmith-Whitwer ticket your worst nightmare?
No, not at all my worst nightmare. I think it's going to be interesting to watch when the two of them get together and decide whether there is a state surplus or not. George Whitwer, during the primary campaign, said, here's how I want to spend the state surplus. Steve Goldsmith said there is no state surplus, so I don't know.
About the state surplus. This
No, they're
fall.
not going to be. But I mean, it's certainly one
What
issue
they're going
where
to
they
be
don't.
talking about is the
are not together.
contrast between. Can I get in now?
You can get in.
Okay, I'm Tom Rose, by the way. The one thing that they are going to be talking about, the voters of Indiana, is deciding between big government liberalism embodied by Frank O'Bannon or small government conservatism embodied by Steve Goldsmith.
The same Frank O'Bannon who has presided over 8 years of no tax increases. The same Frank O'Bannon who.
Actually, if I can interrupt
But
for just a
but
second,
no, you can't interrupt. Can Frank O'Bannon
That's not correct,
really
what
and
Kip just
truly
said.
compete with Steve Goldsmith and now George Whitwer's message of real wholesale? George Whitwer was advocating repealing property taxes. Kip 2. I mean, can they compete with that level of reform?
Well, it'd be real interesting to know how they're going to fund how they're going to fund schools in the state of Indiana without property taxes. That'd be a real interesting debate, and I look forward to that debate during this campaign.
An
for
interesting
sure.
posit to that debate is the fact that Steve Goldsmith has proposed a freeze in property taxes. As you know, Mike, property taxes in Indiana have gone up 90% under Frank O'Bannon. Frank O'Bannon opposes a property tax freeze. What we're talking about is freezing right now where we are in property taxes. They've almost doubled since Frank O'Bannon took office.
This
How are
from
the
the
Democrats-
administration.
how are the Democrats gonna
This
answer
from the
that?
administration that gave us the biggest deficit spending you can imagine. They've done more bonding than you can imagine here in
How
the
are the
city of
Democrats
Indiana.
gonna
Goldsmith
answer
We've
that?
cut a
Taking
quarter
the-
of $1 billion from the city
Prove
budget.
it.
We've cut a quarter of $1
No, you
billion
put it all into
through
debt
identified
financing.
saving.
You
We've
put it into
invested
debt
our savings
financing is
into,
what you've done.
into
You've taken the
dramatically needed
shells and
infrastructure.
you've gone like this.
Oh yeah, Brian Howey, let me ask you a fundamental question here. I mean, does the lieutenant governorship
tax
really
cut if
matter?
you
We're going to hear these kind of
We've
arguments
invested.
about the O'Bannon, the
In
Biden
infrastructure.
administration, and the Goldsmith
Public
I
administration.
agree with Dr. Vargas on one thing, that you look for a lieutenant governor that it doesn't hurt you. I think he's right on target. Again, I disagree with him on the fact that he sees Whitwer as an ideologue and Goldsmith as a pragmatist. I think they come out of the same cloth. I think they're going to be a very compatible ticket. I'd like to know how the Democrats are going to answer the $2 billion increase in the property taxes, which Goldsmith.
$4 billion.
Well, it went from $2 billion to $4 billion, but what's the strategy going to be there?
Well, I think the strategy is we have to look at what Steve Goldsmith says. It's gold speak. We've heard it before. We don't. You can't trust what Steve Goldsmith says. And
So, I mean,
who
is
knows?
that true or not?
I don't know whether it's true or not. I have no idea. They're just
That's
throwing
an
it out
issue.
there, like
That's
they
gonna
said.
be an
It-
issue.
like
Property
they
tax
throw
is
out
gonna be an issue.
irresponsibly
Now,
a property tax.
Frank
freeze. Give me a
O'Bannon's
break.
supposed to be coming out. Is he coming out here in the next week or so with a major initiative in property tax reform or
I think
freeze
so,
or something
but
in the category?
I haven't talked to the campaign about when exactly the date is or the time certain. But
The expectations there, Tom Rose.
Well, there are a couple of other issues that Frank O'Bannon has to answer for. The state government in Indiana is the fastest growing state government in the United
Look,
States,
that
and
is
that
absolutely untrue, and the person who first published that has taken it back and said it was wrong. You guys need to stop quoting it.
No, that
it is
comes
wrong.
from the National
it is
Governors
absolute.
Association.
No, it's
Financial
wrong.
World
The
magazine
guy
rated
said
Frank
it was
O'Bannon's
wrong.
Department of Commerce as the biggest giveaway in the
Look,
United States.
if this campaign
the biggest
is gonna
giveaway
be-
of financial incentives for corporations to locate or stay in it.
If
Those
it-
are issues
if
that
it-
Frank
this
O'Bannon
campaign
is
is
going to
be
deal
run
with
by these guys
between now and election
throwing
day.
out accusations where when the original person who made the statement has said we were wrong, then it's going to be a really bad campaign.
Brian Howey,
Okay,
real quick
what-
parting shot. These conventions were so fundamentally different. There were no contests at the Democratic convention. There was all contests at the Republican convention. who wins the convention wars? Less than a minute,
voters,
real quick.
The voters aren't going to care in October and November about the conventions. I think both parties got out of the conventions what they wanted. The Republicans had a good spirited fight. The Democrats had unity. I think they come out with two good tickets. Indiana voters are going to have a great choice this November.
Okay, that's going to wrap it up for here. We've got to throw it away to Reid Duffy with Duffy's Digest.
Well, the starting lineups for this year's statewide election are in place. Will voters want to continue the carefully crafted caution and prudence of the Evan Bayh administration by going with his respected and folksy Lieutenant Governor Frank O'Bannon, or rev up the motors a bit and see what that young Republican in a hurry out of Indianapolis, Mayor Steve Goldsmith, can do with his intriguing plan to privatize just about anything that isn't nailed down in state government? The Lieutenant Governor candidates offer something of a contrast. O'Bannon handpicked his, South Bend Mayor Joe Kernan, relishing his role as the campaign Doberman, chewing on Republicans in ways that allow the gentlemanly O'Bannon to more or less remain a gentleman. Goldsmith allowed the delegates at the state Republican convention to choose his, and they picked one of his former primary opponents, George Whitwer, for three reasons. Number one, he's a staunch conservative. Number two, he's not from Marion County. And number three, and perhaps most importantly of all, he's not from Marion County. Most delegates not from Marion County feel those pals who are get their say and their way far more often than they do. Thus, they feel a quota on Marion County candidates is in order, and for that this year, their quota is Steve Goldsmith. Thus, Whitwer trounced the seeming favorite Sue Ann Gilroy after many delegates asked, excuse me, didn't we elect her Secretary of State just 2 years ago? And didn't she announce her candidacy about an hour and a half before the doors of the convention opened this morning? And if memory serves me, isn't she from Marion County? But then how does that explain Steve Carter, the man Republicans nominated to be their candidate for Attorney General? He's been practicing law and state politics in Indianapolis for several years now, but he convinced delegates that he was weaned and molded by his formative years spent in Northwest Indiana, and that anything he's done in Marion County since then should be considered missionary work. Actually, what impressed several hundred delegates about Carter were the mornings they went outside to get their newspaper and found Carter greeting them with coffee, bagel, and fresh squeezed orange juice, while other delegates recalled coming home from work to find Carter mowing their lawn or shoveling their walk. That kind of one-on-one hustle leaves a deep impression with impressionable delegates. Carter now faces the equally hard-charging Democrat Jeffrey Modisett, a proven vote-getter who was once elected Marion County prosecutor as a Democrat, which happens once every Haley's Comet. Modisett has already challenged Carter to a series of debates about an office Hoosiers know little about, and blissfully so. Challenging your opponent to debate is often a sign a candidate fears he is running behind. You don't think Modisett fears, and Republicans fervently hope, that Indiana voters will confuse Steve Carter with the popular outgoing incumbent Attorney General, Pam Carter? I got to think we're paying a little more attention than that.
Thanks, Reid, and thanks for joining us for this edition of the Mike Pence Show, the O'Bannon team versus the Goldsmith team, rating the matchups. And all I can tell you is looking at the two teams that both parties have assembled is that the voters will be well served in this fall's election. And a personal note to my longtime friend George Whitwer, congratulations, pal. You deserve it. I'm Mike Pence.